The feminist performance piece, A Rapist in Your Path, was first performed in Chile in November 2019. It quickly went viral because it resonated with women in particular, with street performances by activists around the world, including in Ireland. And the central point of the piece is to highlight the complicity of the state in violence against women. And many here today might think that that has little relevance to the Irish state, but I'm sorry to say that that would be entirely wrong. Citizens' Assembly Recommendation 34A was endorsed by 98.9% and calls on the state to, quote, support justice for victims' survivors by reviewing and reforming the court system, including the family courts, to better protect and support victims, survivors of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence and their dependents, and remove barriers to justice. 34B, endorsed by a vote of 95.6%, calls for developing guidelines and specialist training for judges and lawyers regarding the treatment of victims and survivors. Yet several times now in this chamber, I raised the issue of the now retired Judge James O'Connor blatantly and repeatedly sexually harassing multiple women who came to his court for his assistance. Okay. When one of the women reported the harassment to the Gardaí, she was told that it was a case of boy meets girl and there was nothing to investigate. We know that GSOC was of little use, and so far the Taoiseach has also been of no help. This pattern of state harassment, of state violence against women, and of minimising and ignoring it is not an isolated incident. There was a well-known US study which found that police officers are 15 times more likely to be perpetrators of domestic violence than the general population. An incredible 40% of them self-reported as having perpetrated domestic violence in the previous year. For some, it is a small step, or no step at all, from enforcing the legal violence used by the capitalist state to protect the private property of the rich, mostly against marginalised groups like those suffering from addiction, those suffering from homelessness, to taking the step to beating their partner in the home, or even to preying on women in the course of their police work, as we saw with the brutal murder of Sarah Everard. Channel 4 News in England recently reported that one woman a week is now coming forward with complaints of domestic abuse by police officers. And every woman Channel 4 spoke to said that the police, quote, failed to investigate their own. Perhaps that's not surprising for a police force in which the murder of Sarah Everard was casually nicknamed the rapist by his colleagues. But what is the situation here? In the past few months alone, we have learned that barring orders have been taken out against at least 21 serving Gardaí since 2019, that 9 of those Gardaí are under investigation for alleged breaches of the barring orders and 5 for alleged coercive control. This follows on revelations that the Gardaí cancelled more than 3,999 calls from women in distress seeking assistance from the state to protect them from domestic violence in their own homes. Even in instances when victims of domestic violence did get a response, an internal Garda investigation found that, quote, in some cases they failed to follow procedures for dealing with such cases and did not make further checks, either phone calls or visits, to the victim in the days that followed. This is the Irish version of A Rapist in Your Path, where agents of the state, the ones who are supposed to protect women from violence, are often the worst perpetrators of gender-based violence and are also complicit in covering it up. I also want to make some brief points in relation to the abortion law review, because we know that the fundamental right of bodily autonomy is a necessary starting point for any possibility of gender equality, and we know that was until recently completely denied to women in Ireland courtesy of the 8th Amendment. The magnificent mass movement for repeal culminated in a resounding 2/3 majority vote in favour of legislating for access to abortion on the 25th of May 2018. Since then, thousands of pregnant people have legally accessed abortion care in this country. But it remains the case that a substantial minority of women are still forced to travel to Britain. Last year, at the height of the COVID pandemic, almost 200 women were forced to travel. It was 375 the year before. A third had received a devastating diagnosis of fatal fetal abnormality but were refused abortion care here. One of the main reasons it's still happening is that Section 23 of the Health Regulation of Termination of Pregnancy Act 2018 criminalises doctors who get a diagnosis wrong and perform an abortion outside the provisions of the Act, with a prison sentence of up to 14 years. This draconian clause is having a serious chilling effect. The Journal reported earlier in the year that 85% of pregnant people who came to the advocacy group, Terminations for Medical Reasons, for help, ended up still having to travel for a termination, many of them for abnormalities commonly recognised as fatal. So the forthcoming review of the Act must address this injustice by decriminalising abortion in order to remove the chilling effect on doctors and legislating for the right to choose in full without any term limits. One of the mottos of the repeal campaign was trust women. We need to do this not only as the best way of assisting pregnant people faced with devastating decisions about fatal fetal abnormalities and fetal anomalies, but in order to help all women who need abortion care. Only they can make the right decision for them. A second major issue with the 2018 Act is the ridiculous, patronising and damaging 3-day wait period for abortion care. It treats women like airheads, incapable of knowing their own minds from one day to the next. Its sole reason for existing is as a sop for misogynistic anti-choicers. It also must go in the review. As with all restrictions on abortion, this has the worst impact on marginalised women who may struggle to attend repeated, unnecessary medical appointments. This includes women suffering domestic violence, migrant women, young women, single parents with no one to mind their kids, and women living in the many areas in this country without abortion access. A final important issue is the failure of the government to introduce promised legislation on safe access zones to prevent the harassment of women accessing abortion services and of women simply attending GPs or maternity hospitals by anti-choice zealots. Earlier this week, I stood with activists from Together for Safety, along with many others, to demand that this legislation proceed as a matter of urgency. That must also be done. Thank you.